All right, so I'm going to be presenting on aquatic organism passage and wildlife crossings. So salmon are undoubtedly a main focus of our fish passage work, and we do a lot based on what it takes for salmon to get from point A to point B. But in this presentation, we're going to take a little segue to examine other species important to consider in stream crossings. So looking at different aquatic organisms reinforces the need for a continuation of stream-like conditions in culverts. When salmon passage is the only goal in the project, solutions such as fish ladders can serve the purpose of moving salmon or even other species. However, a more holistic stream-centric vision of stream crossings should benefit more than one species and multiple stream processes. This talk will identify non-salmon considerations for stream crossings. Next slide. So the main document that I relied on for this is the 2008 U.S. Forest Service document, Stream Simulation, an Ecological Approach to Providing Passage for Aquatic Organisms at Road Crossings. And this document goes through aquatic organism passage, and then it has, a fish crossing calculation component. But for now, we're just going to go through the ideas on why aquatic organism passage is important and some of the considerations to enable aquatic organism passage. So the focus of the U.S. Forest Service Guide is to help national forests achieve their goal of maintaining the physical and biological integrity of the stream systems that they manage, including existing populations of fish and other wildlife species. So the work seeks to reduce habitat fragmentation, which is a key factor in contributing to population declines of many fish and other species. Stream simulation provides continuity through crossing structures, allowing all the aquatic species present to move freely through them to access habitats, avoid adverse conditions, and seek food and mates. Stream simulation to access habitats, avoid adverse conditions, and seek food and mates. Stream simulation applies to crossing structures on anything in the transportation network. So this can be roads, trails, or railroads. Okay, next slide. So when we're looking at the aquatic species, there are multiple species that inhabit the freshwater at some stage in their life history. And while not all are anadromous or migratory, they all require movement in the freshwater system to access food, avoid predation, spawn, or access seasonal or life stage specific habitat. They also might move around just to find temperatures that work best for them at those certain life stages. Many in Alaska that are migratory also have specific habitat needs beyond their migration. One such of these species is the Pacific lamprey. Next slide. So lamprey are an example of a species that have multiple habitat needs at various life stages, as well as a migratory component. And they require access to these habitats for success. Spawning occurs in medium-sized rivers and smaller tributaries, and the streams, redds are constructed in gravel and cobble at the downstream ends of pools, runs, or glides. Then the next life stage is the amosete, and they require fine sand and or silty depositional areas covered with a layer of detritus. And these habitats provide opportunities for filter feeding and are most common in unchannelized streams with complex channel morphology and seasonal floodplain wetlands and backwater areas. And they're in this habitat for 4 to 6 years. Then they emerge as macrothalmia, and they migrate downstream passively, carried by the current to mainstream rivers and eventually the sea. So in this life stage, they require resting habitat that provides cover and low flows that are essential, as well as unimpeded flow and passage to the ocean. Then they're in the ocean for a while, and they return not necessarily to their natal stream, but to a freshwater stream, and they have adult upstream migration. So adult migration to freshwater from the ocean requires deep pools with good cover for hiding from predators. And while lamprey are they're able to climb up obstacles using their oral disc as a suction cup, successful passage over dams or through culverts is dependent on the surface being smooth and wet with low velocity. And here you can kind of see how this might have a little bit of a contradiction with what we want for salmon. A lot of times we're trying to achieve a roughness in the culverts, and you see that lamprey actually, in order to effectively use their suction cup or in the oral disc, they need smoother surfaces to hold on to. So for watershed scale habitat requirements, stream and river reaches that have relatively stable flow conditions with a mix of deep pools with good hiding cover, such as boulders and large wood, low velocity rearing areas with fine sand or silt, and silt-free cobble areas upstream of rearing areas. And they also prefer summer temperatures that rarely or do not exceed 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So in this example, you see that there's multiple freshwater habitats and needs to access them in addition to the migratory requirements. And although there are large data gaps, especially for Alaska lamprey, there's actually more information on lamprey than for many of the other species we have. One of the things that this reinforces is that in stream simulation, we build to mimic the natural stream, as we might not be able to anticipate or to create habitat necessary for all life stages of all present fish species. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another consideration in aquatic organism passage is amphibians and insects. So passage is important in its own right for these, as well as for the benefits that they can confer to the overall ecosystem health, like as a food source. In a review of amphibians and road crossings, it was seen that amphibians do not do well in road crossings. They do fare better crossing under roads, but they were seen to avoid narrow, long culverts, and they showed a preference for culverts that had substrate. Macroinvertebrate populations in the municipality of Anchorage were seen to decrease with as trace elements and salt concentrations increased with increasing population, road, and storm drain densities. So aquatic organism passage for amphibians and macroinvertebrates might necessitate identifying stormwater, bank vegetation, and road treatment such as salt and gravel, as well as incorporating stream simulation to benefit these populations. Okay, next slide. Oh, actually, you can move one more. I meant to cut the slide. Sorry, Debbie. Thank you. Okay, now we're going on to mammal passage that's under roads. So the next, so this deals with mammals, and many times the reasons that you're going to do these crossings is more focused on road safety. Some of the passages are not even associated with streams, but there are some unique design considerations. In addition to the crossing itself, many times you need to have fencing or walls that would actually direct the animals to use the crossings. Animals that were not strong swimmers preferred dry ledges throughout the crossing to enable passage without getting wet. Also, many mammals preferred to cross in areas with low water levels within the crossing. There were some consistent deterrents to crossing, long culverts. There are some examples of construction materials that seem to deter animals from entering into under road passages. And then obviously the height of the structure in comparison to the species that would be using the structure. Okay, next slide. So mammal passage is important for road safety and helping to avoid collisions, but it also has ecological importance, as we talked about with the habitat fragmentation. In Alaska, a 2015 study using microsatellite data found evidence of a recent genetic subdivision among moose that corresponded to the Glen Highway and the fencing. This subdivision was most likely due to restrictions in gene flow due to alterations to the highway, which has moose-resistant fencing with one-way gates. And then there was a significant increase in traffic volumes over the past 30 years. They also looked at the Kenai Peninsula, and they did not see this genetic subdivision for the Sterling Highway. But there were concerns that with increasing traffic that this could become a problem. Additionally, terrestrial scavengers and their freedom of movement is important because they may move 58 to 90% of all the salmon biomass to the land, sometimes hundreds of meters from the streams. So in that earlier question, this also might answer some of the question about, lateral and what the importance is in a stream system. It also, having passage enables access to food sources, water, minerals, and mates. And minerals can be a really important one because they can be very limiting. And so being able to access them might mean being able to get to a few select spots. Next slide, please. So we have some nearby good examples of underpasses on the Sterling Highway that were begun in 2017. It was a project between milepost 58 and 79 in the refuge, and almost 1.3 million vehicles pass through this section of the Sterling Highway, and it bisects the refuge. It was seen that wolves and bears do tend to avoid the highway and traffic, but they can be attracted to roadkill, whereas moose are actively attracted to roads for browse, salt, and easy walking in high snow. There's approximately 250 vehicle moose collisions per year on the peninsula. So in this project, 6 wildlife underpasses were constructed, as well as 9-foot high fencing that had what they call jump outs, which are ramps that encourage the moose to pass to the non-road side of the fence. So it kind of angles the, it's a ramp angled to try to, get moose that are on the highway side of the fence to go back into the refuge. And those jump outs are placed every 1/8 of a mile. So the picture here is one of the underpasses, which is a 140-foot bridge over the East Fork of the Moose River, which is an anadromous stream. And it was designed to be 18 feet high to accommodate large ungulates. The other 5 underpasses are large culverts that are ranging in height from 8 feet for bears and lynx to twin culverts for moose, each 16 feet high. So to determine where to put the crossings, they used GPS collar data for moose and caribou to look for areas of frequent crossings. They also looked at moose vehicle collision reports and wildlife observations to aid in the placement of these crossings. Okay, next slide. So this is crossing that's over roads, not under. So wildlife corridors over roads are locations where animals can roam without interference, and they're also called nature highways. They benefit animals both large and small, and in most cases are seen to be more effective than underpasses, but they're also more expensive. However, when I saw, when it says more expensive, I often think, when they start the math on what the expense of a project is, if you've already designed your road and then you're saying, oh, we can add on an overpass or an underpass, then obviously the overpasses are going to be more expensive, especially if they're built to be kind of these nature highways. However, if you start kind of doing your calculations of the expense of a project that incorporates the cost savings due to collisions, which can be very significant, not even mentioning the potential loss of life of animals as well as humans, then it starts to pencil out a little bit more. So wildlife crossing structures designed or retrofitted to provide safe passage for wildlife were seen in a study to reduce wildlife collisions by up to 97%. Corridors use fencing and studies of natural migration routes to build in locations that are likely to be used by mammals. The example that's shown here is the arches that was built over the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff National Park, Alberta. The project began when the Canadian government allotted $100 million to reducing car wildlife collisions. And that money was used to fence the entire highway more than 100 miles and build 6 overpasses and several dozen underpasses. These corridors have been seen to be used by 11 large mammalian species and crossed more than 200,000 times between 1996 and 2009. And they've been seen to be quite effective. But you see how, like, there's the crossing itself, and there's just beautiful pictures of different wildlife corridors. But the fencing is pretty extensive for these projects. And, you know, in this one is 100 miles of fencing, kind of leading animals to use these passages, which you would think might get out of the home range of some of the species that they were trying to provide passage for.
2-minute warning there, Erika. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks, Jess. Okay, this next slide is some resources that the Forest Service put out that I thought were just great and wanted to share them. They identify that crossings are species specific, but creating habitat that mimics the surrounding area can work for a variety of species in the location. And they just kind of go through like some of the ideas that seem to work for all species, you know, and then they go into some of the specifics of different habitats and how to mimic it. And a lot of it goes back to, you know, looking at what you have and then trying to see what you can incorporate in these wildlife corridors. Kind of more recent news, the Infrastructure Act creates a pilot grant program that focuses specifically on wildlife crossing safety. And it was funded at $350 million over the next 5 years. So there's potential that we could be seeing more of these wildlife corridors. I did also see, and I'm not super up to date on the new highway section at Cooper Landing, but I did see in at least one of the versions that an overpass for wildlife was included. I'm not sure if that's made it through into the finals, but I thought that was interesting that was a consideration. Okay, next slide. So in conclusion, providing for aquatic organism passage and wildlife passage enables resilience in the communities. By mimicking the natural surrounding environment or stream, passage can be achieved for a variety of species in the processes that sustain them. Okay.